the continuation of migration crises, particularly affecting Europe. President Trump has shut the border. That is not the case in Europe, where migration continues to be the issue that is roiling pretty much every European country. Well, that is particularly affecting the UK. A few weeks ago, I had the opportunity to sit down with the former Prime Minister of the UK, Liz Truss. We were in Hungary, and we talked about that issue, among others. Here's what she had to say. Well, Liz Truss, former Prime Minister of Great Britain, thanks so much for taking the time. Really appreciate it.
Great to be here.
So why don't we start with what should be done about immigration policy? Obviously, this is sort of the elephant in the room.
It's really not the elephant in the room because everybody in Britain is talking about it.
Yeah.
Everybody is talking about it. You've got to you've got to repeal the Human Rights Act. You've got to change the judiciary so they're actually accountable. At the moment, we have a Supreme Court that was only invented in 2005. You know, we had 1,000 years of the Lord Chancellor, who was a democratically appointed individual deciding who the senior judges were. Tony Blair changed all that. He created a Supreme Court. It's not accountable. You've got to change all that. You've got to make sure you've got a proper judiciary making proper decisions. You've got to get rid of these human rights excuses for allowing to stay in the country, because that is what is going on at the moment. And you just have to say no to more immigration. And that means taking on the Treasury and the Bank of England, because those are the people pursuing the high migration policies, because they're saying the only way we're going to keep Britain afloat is not by Britons having more children, which is obviously what we should be doing. It's actually by importing more migrants, and those people have to be taken on. So that is what has to happen.
I mean, it's kind of amazing how for well over 20 years, there's been open talk in Britain about how multiculturalism has failed. I remember when David Cameron was saying this. He was saying that multiculturalism was not a success. And yet the importation of migrants from third world countries who hate the West just continued apace.
But this is all part of the absurd idea that's the way you balance the books. And that's driven by the Treasury, the Bank of England, all of their sort of people in the media. They're saying if you cut migration, the British economy will go bust. I've got news for them. The British economy is going bust anyway. It's happening anyway. If you look at the rates of bonds, the bond price, it's much higher than when I was in office now. But nobody is creating a fuss about it because they've all bought into this model. They've all bought into the idea that net zero is going to give you more jobs, that migration is going to make everybody richer. That's obviously not true, but nobody wants to admit that they've got the last 40 years of policy so deeply wrong. And this is why the establishment is fighting back so viciously and fought back so viciously against what I said, because it would force them into a massive rethink. And it's the same, you can see the same thing going on in the United States with the attacks on Donald Trump's economic policies, because people don't want to admit that they got it so badly wrong.
You know, one of the things that just keeps occurring to me every time I look at the news from Britain is something that is true of the United States also, and maybe the West more generally, just an incredible shyness about championing what Britain is and what it historically has been. And so what comes to mind here is when Britain hosted the Olympics, and there was an entire display about the NHS, like a gigantic display of like dancing syringes and such for the National Health Service. It's like, this is the country that brought the world the Magna Carta, as you mentioned, free speech, parliament, right? Like these are all concepts that built the modern world, all of it. And what they chose to celebrate was a giant welfare system that has many women giving birth in hallways. And it's just like, what was the trade here? And can there be a restoration of a true pride in what Great Britain was and should be in the middle of this bizarre sort of melange of multiculturalism that seems to have taken over London?
You know, the views expressed, you know, in the Olympic ceremony are not the views of the average Briton. The problem is we have an elite that hates Britain. And they have done for some time. And that is, you know, the history of people like Jeremy Corbyn, Keir Starmer. They want to help the human rights of anybody who doesn't live in Britain, but they're very reticent about actually defending our own interests. And you know, we need to be much more, we need to galvanize the people who are patriots in our country, but they have been neglected. They generally don't live in London. They live in small towns. They live in rural areas. They don't have much of a voice. And what is happening is the elite are trying to suppress those voices. So we need a media revolution like you've had in the United States with things like the Daily Wire, you know, with Joe Rogan, all of that actually gets the message across about what people are actually thinking about what's actually going on in our country. that has to be the start of changing, because I know people in Britain do want change. They voted for Brexit, even though the establishment told them it would be a disaster and it would be terrible for the British economy and no one would ever speak to us again. They voted for it because they want change. The problem has been that when politicians get into office, they get captured by this establishment bureaucracy. And I know, because I tried to go against it, that you get pretty harshly punished if you go for it. So what we've got to do is we've got to learn from Trump. He had the experience in his first term of having people in his administration that were disloyal. He had a media that was actively hostile. And what's happened in between is Project 2025 was built up, alternative media was built up to give the Trump campaign more momentum. And when he got into office, he had a plan of what to do. That is exactly what needs to happen in Britain. And to be honest, the leadership is one part of it. We can talk for hours about whether it should be Reform or the Conservatives or a combination of the two. But there's a hell of a lot of other stuff that needs to happen in our country so that the voices of normal Brits are actually driving the country's policy rather than the Davos elite. I mean, Keir Starmer was famously asked, which do you prefer, Westminster or the World Economic Forum? And he chose the World Economic Forum. I thought it was the most revelatory interview he's ever given because he said it. He said it. He literally is batting for the Davos elite. And that is not what the people of Britain want.
If you're a homeowner, you need to listen to this. In today's AI and cyber world, scammers are stealing home titles and your equity is the target. Here's how it works. Criminals forge your signature on one document. They use a fake notary stamp. They pay a small fee with your county, and just like that, your home title is now transferred out of your name. Then they take out loans using your equity or even sell your property, and you won't even know that it's happened until you get a collection or a foreclosure notice. So when is the last time you actually checked on your home title? Well, if your answer is like most people, never, you probably should do that right now. And that's why I've partnered with Home Title Lock, so you can find out today if you're already a victim. A lot of people at the Daily Wire, including people on this team, trust Home Title Lock to protect what is likely one of their biggest assets. Again, much of your value, just as a person with assets, is in the chief asset you own, which is your home. Why would you make that vulnerable? Use my promo code Shapiro at HometitleLock.com. You'll get a free title history report and a free trial of their $1 million triple lock protection. That's 24/7 monitoring of your title, urgent alerts to any changes, and if fraud does happen, they'll spend up to $1 million to fix it. Don't be a victim. Protect your equity today. Go to HometitleLock.com. Use promo code Shapiro. That's HometitleLock.com. Promo code Shapiro. So you mentioned before that question that obviously is coming up a lot right now, the Conservative Party versus the Reform Party. What is the future of the right in Britain? Is the Reform Party just sort of cannibalizing a chunk of the Conservative Party, or are the two parties together going to be more than the sum of their parts? What do you make of that question? Which if you were of the right in Britain, where should you be putting your eggs? Where should you be putting your pressure? Where should you put your vote?
What's interesting about Reform is they are winning areas from Labour now. So the traditional working class areas, people that are patriots, people who believe in Britain, are thoroughly, annoyed with Keir Starmer. So they are voting and supporting the Reform Party. So it's a different electoral coalition. Just like in America, the way that Trump was able to win over bits of the Rust Belt, the same thing is happening with Reform in Britain. And Boris Johnson, to some extent, won those people over. But the problem is, once he got into office, the Conservatives didn't deliver the policies because so many Conservative MPs are part of the establishment. They don't want to be unpopular at dinner parties. They don't want to upset their friends who work in the big corporations or the Bank of England or are human rights lawyers. So they don't want to fight. And I think that the winning coalition has to be people in Britain who are prepared to take on that establishment. I think there's an open question about whether Nigel Farage is actually prepared to do that. Or, does he just become another David Cameron who goes into office promising all sorts of things and doesn't deliver it? But the big message I want to get across to the British public is we have a problem, not just with politicians, but with the deep state, with the administrative state, with our establishment. And those are the people who also need to be challenged. And a lot of those institutions need to be dismantled because they're simply not working for Britain. And what I think has happened over the last 10 years is people have now become skeptical of the police. They become skeptical of the judiciary. They become skeptical because they can see that justice isn't being done. And that's a very dangerous position for a country to be in.
I mean, this does raise a broader sort of European question that we're seeing repeated in a wide variety of countries, which is a party that's to the right of kind of the normie right party that starts to gain an enormous amount of sway, AfD in Germany or National Rally in France, and then moves that are made by sort of the establishment parties to bar those and even cross the aisle to the far left rather than trying to make any concessions to that right. Where does the Conservative Party in Britain lie along that spectrum?
I don't think that's so true in Britain, because I think the danger is that reform become part of the establishment. That's the British way, is to infiltrate and to sort of try and smooth things over. And any incoming prime minister, the civil service will say, "Oh yes, prime minister, we will get straight to it. We will action everything you say." And what you find out is they haven't actioned it, and a week later nothing's happened. So that the British approach, I mean, you've probably seen Yes Minister and Yes Prime Minister, is more manipulative than an outright ban. So I don't think we'd see an outright ban of reform. I think the danger is that these issues that have plagued Britain, certainly since the 1990s, but even way far back. It goes right back to the 1850s, the Northcote Rebellion, where the permanent bureaucracy was invented. These issues that have plagued our country for over a century need to be dealt with. And that's a discussion that I want to see the Conservative Party and the Reform Party having. They need to get serious about what the problem is in our country. Otherwise, we're not going to fix it. And Donald Trump, by talking about the deep state, by talking about the swamp, he started explaining to people what was actually going wrong. And that discussion hasn't really happened yet in Britain, partly because we have an incredibly supine media that just feed off leaks from the bureaucracy. That's where they get all their information from, and they're completely part of the cabal.
So what's next for you personally? Obviously, you've been out of government for a little while. What do you want to do next?
Well, I'm still very committed to getting the change we need in Britain. I believe the media is absolutely key. So I'm working on a new free speech media network to try and bring the type of energy that you're bringing in the United States to the UK and Europe. I think that's incredibly important. I think it's important we work with other conservative, other patriots across Europe and America. That's why I'm here at CPAC, because we all face the same battle against what is a very powerful international network. The Davos elite, the EU, all of these organizations. We even found out that USAID was funding Tony Blair. They were funding the Tony Blair Institute. So, they've been funding a lot of the Soros activity. So I think I'm interested in how we work together to take these forces on. People that believe in free speech, that believe in sovereignty, that believe in the family, that believe in patriotism. That's where the future lies, and that's what I'm working on.
Well, Liz Truss, thank you so much for stopping by. It's been wonderful.
It's great to see you.
Well, that's all for now, folks. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment your thoughts down below. Be sure to check out all of the other great content on my channel. I'll see you here next time.